Welcome to Pantheism TV. I'm your host, Guyus Seralius, and with me today is Peter Moriarty, a philosophical and political online commentator. And do you consider yourself to be a pantheist? I can't remember.
I definitely consider myself a pantheist. It's
Okay.
biotheism, as I've promoted it, is a more or less a fusion of pantheism with deep ecology, and then a number of other things, including organicism, reverence for life. But pantheism is
Okay.
always going to be central to my position.
Okay. And so today we're going to be trying to discuss whether or not the universe had a first-time creation point, or has the universe always existed and always will exist, and also try to cover areas about the Big Bang theory itself and whether or not it's a good theory. Um, One of the things I'd like to just ask you in a more natural, when for the last 10, 15 years, what do you instinctively feel, or what's your impression that the universe did have an origin and a birth, or that it has always existed? Putting aside all the science, just instinctively.
Well, and because you introduced it that way, I should just say, this discussion is going to be a little bit more in the realm of metaphysics. I don't consider myself, and I'm definitely not an astrophysicist. And even in terms of astronomy, it's something that I've always been interested in. But this is going to be a lot of speculation, and I don't make any claims that I've got some serious hard science to prove my positions. But then again, I also understand that this entire discussion is theoretical, even for the experts, because we've got experts who are just disagreeing on a lot of things. And I think that at this point, what we're doing is we're in a state of thinking in terms of our hypotheses and basically exploring possible ways to understand and explain this.
And just from a philosophical point of view. So,
Sure. And you know what? I try with most of my philosophy to avoid metaphysics, but we're going to go and do something a little different here because, this is as I mentioned to you before we started recording, my wheelhouse is biology and Earth. And, my interests are more about Earth, but this is important because this is going to be, what context is Earth in?
Yeah, and I actually always try to base all my philosophical views, no matter how fantastic they are or may be, I try to root it in science, what we think we know today so far. Because I actually have a huge appreciation for science and the scientific method. So I'm always constantly trying to, even though I don't always agree with mainstream science, in fact, a lot often, there are still, I think it's one of the best ways to try to predict the world we live in and to try to understand it, to try to use observation and what data we have, So, yeah.
Of course. So getting to your question, I think about, was there ever a time where there was no universe? And not even a time, but a time where before this universe began, where there was never anything and it was always nothing. And then suddenly that changed and there was something. And that strikes me as just very inconsistent. So it has to be, in my sense, that there always was something, and that there always was something more or less like this universe. As we know, this universe is so hugely varied. So what that means can be so many different things. But I think that there's always been existence, whether it's been this universe and what even it means to say, the word universe, meaning a one, a unity and a plurality. And it's basically saying all of this is one. So we might say that just by the word universe itself, that it has to have always been, and that anything that was or anything that ever will be must be part of this universe. And the idea of saying like a multiverse, well, that doesn't really make sense, because multiverse is just saying, it's basically more or less saying multi multi. Universe is meant to say everything is one.
That's exactly right. In fact, let me just quickly, this is a good opportunity. Let me just quickly read what my personal definition of the universe, because that's important, because different people kind of think of it differently. The term universe, according to its original use, means the totality of all things that exist and is synonymous with the word cosmos. The term multiverse, meaning multiple universes, is, in the grand scheme of things, is kind of relatively new and was popularized by mainstream modern science as a fix to work around the limited idea of a finite universe. So as I use the term, any and all subsets of the universe may be called parallel world, multi-worlds, multiverses, subworlds, etc. But in my view, it's all part of the one overall infinite universe. In fact, that actually means one song. So the totality of it all, the whole package. So the entire universal set. So I don't mind, I'm not opposed to subsets, or there can be all kinds of parallel universes or whatever, and that can be infinite, but it's all part of that one universal set. And so that's what we're talking about today, is that one universal set. And similar to what you were saying, I've had the exact same experience, that I always thought there would always have to be something that would initiate that beginning, whatever that is. And then something would have to initiate the initiator, and then something would have to initiate. So it kind of creates an infinite line of regression, kind of like a dog chasing its own tail. You just keep digging a deeper hole. So there would always have to be the conditions, in other words, like who set the stage for that, or what set the stage, or what was the stage to set that into motion. And contrary to, I know that Lawrence Krauss has given lectures on something from nothing with Richard Dawkins. And as I was saying a little earlier, Richard joins in on these conversations because he somewhat agrees that, certain things could have happened early on. In fact, he always describes it as kind of like, I don't know, like a soup of energy. And from that, but Lawrence Krauss will actually defend the idea of absolute, the something that's coming from absolute nothingness. And I just always struggled with that, and had, in fact, if you go back to ancient Greece, I think his name is Parmenides, and there were other Greek philosophers that also believed it was impossible to have something come from nothing. So yeah, why? I mean, I've listened to his lecture before, and I just didn't buy it, that you could actually have something come from nothing. And I used to, when I was a kid, I used to try to imagine what that state would be, the nothingness. I would try to first. I think I try to imagine that it's all black, it's all darkness, and then there's what is it, gray or white, and so I can even imagine that a situation where there is nothing.
I just watched a video the other day, and it was about the Beatles' song "Across the Universe." And in one point of the song, John Lennon is saying, "Nothing's gonna change my mind," and that comes from he and the Beatles were hanging out with the Maharishi down.
I remember this. Yes, I just watched a documentary on that. Yeah,
this gets into another idea of nothing that is much more aligned with this idea of Buddhism, is that when you finally extinguish your own internal desires, and then when you finally basically clear your mind, that you've cleared your mind, and what's in your mind is now nothing. But this nothing that is behind all the phenomenon, behind thoughts, if we're talking in terms of just psychic phenomenon only, it's what's behind the thoughts is a silence. But in terms of phenomenon, what is maybe behind all phenomenon is a nothing that is not necessarily nothing as in what we understand as an absolute zero. It may be, and this is basically what I think is the concept of what nothing is that you've got a constant vibration in all things, and everything is vibration. But these vibrations are the positives and negatives. But in terms of quantum values, when all positives and all negatives are exactly equal and they come together, they merge into an apparent nothing. But it's like the surface of the water. Imagine if you're in an ocean and all of the waves finally calm down, and now we have absolute perfect mirror of water, and above the water is the reflection of everything. It reflects itself, and so you no longer can see it. It's more of not a nothing, but it's everything collapsed into itself to where there's no visibility of movement, and there's no quantum energy expressed, but it's all locked into itself. All negatives and all positives have basically canceled each other out, but there's still that potential is still there.
You kind of triggered a thought. I used to try to be open to the idea of at least, like, even if it's cyclical, for example, let's say there's the Big Bang and then it'll one day come to a big crunch, because a lot of scientists and philosophers think that. And then I thought it bothered me that because because of my worldview, my model, my philosophical worldview, I can't see how you can, because I view the universe as an infinite thing. And so I can't encapsulate all possible copies into a singularity, into a box, so to speak. So like all of the universe, and then you got to ask yourself, well, what's beyond that? In fact, I used to think, like, if somehow in the future we somehow traveled to the very edge of the known universe, the observable universe, or what they say is the edge, do they think there would be some determinator where there's just not, like, I don't get that. Like, what is that? Nothingness? Is it black? What is that?
Well, if you can travel faster, really faster than the speed of light, because if everything's moving outward, and it's slowing down at this point, but if it was moving out and then you were in the middle of it, but then you shot your spaceship to the edge, well, you would start at one point, once you got to the edge, you would be the known universe, and you'd be ahead of, all the energy that's coming from some central force, and then you would be expanding the universe, faster than the universe itself.
I thought they said that the further out, they actually now see that it's actually moving faster and faster. They first theorized that it might slow down, but I think the current consensus is that it's actually getting faster and faster the further out it is, which is kind of a weird, mind-boggling thought in of itself. But
yes, I think that, okay, so if that is the new, the consensus, and we're still, because this is all theoretical at this point, or hypothetical, we can talk about a lot of different things. And, I'm not making any claims of being at the absolute, cutting edge or the forefront of the current discoveries and the mathematics. And it very well may be like you say. But then again, we also have a lot of times where it's like, oh, we thought that was the case, but that there was a reason why, and it very well could be that the universe keeps expanding, and at a certain point, well, let's not even, I can't necessarily say at a certain point, but in any case, originally I used to think, when I first understood the Big Bang, I thought of it in terms of like a yo-yo effect, that it started from a certain point, it all came out in this massive rush to the outside. And then at a certain point, it lost not only all the momentum, but everything, all the movement started changing. And basically the momentum outward started being counterbalanced by the gravitational pull inward. And as the momentum outward slowed down, that the gravitation of everything would pull it all back together, and it would all come crashing in on itself. And then at that point of crashing, it's going to then basically all phenomenon, all properties of matter, all laws of time and space come crushing down into the singularity. And then that moment creates such a point of extreme pressure that we have it bouncing back out again.
Yeah,
conception into some degree.
If there was that first time expansion, that one of the other thing that bothered me about that is I would think that, and for those who don't know, who are watching, we're talking about the point particle, the singularity, which is supposed to be infinitely dense and super hot, which is weird also to me, because if you have heat, you must have motion, and if you have motion, you must have time. but time's
Well,
not
the
supposed to really
pressures
exist
and the
yet.
heat and the pressures. See, that's how I feel like originally my thought was that the heat and the pressure was basically so intense, but then the gravitational pull was even just that one fraction of a percentage higher that it pulled
Yeah.
it in. But then that heat and intensity, once it came to a certain point, shot everything back out
But
again.
in order to have heat, you would have to have motion, and if in order to have motion, you would have to have time. And I thought, and I could be wrong about this, don't they describe the singularity as before time existed? So it's like, how could motion and heat exist if time doesn't exist yet? And then the other thing that always disturbed me is, or I just thought about, is shouldn't it be symmetrical? Like when this thing expands out, shouldn't it be perfectly symmetrical? Because if it is asymmetrical, which is what it seems to be, the distribution of the universe, what caused that offset, that first offset, for it to start doing whatever it did? And so that's why I started thinking there always had to be antecedents. There always had to be a previous condition. And then I finally started viewing it as that the universe is more like where you have multiple big bangs, like an infinite array of collapsing and expanding things happening, kind of like frothing bubbles in a cosmic bubble bath. And that's like an infinite kind of a thing. That there is no one single thing that completely collapses into a single, a singularity. That's why I started struggling with that. I don't know, shortly after high school, I just started really thinking, I don't know, to
So that
encapsulate.
actually that reflects kind of my own my evolution in my thinking. Originally, once I was introduced to the idea of the Big Bang, then I thought of this idea of the big yo-yo. And
Yeah,
then
the
I started
cyclical.
thinking, just like you're saying, that maybe it's not all happening at just one place, and maybe that it's
Right.
that basically it's the effervescence of the universe, and and we do know that there's several black holes in
Yes.
areas
Right.
that we've been able to map out. And so maybe it's that these black holes are points of intense intense concentrations of energy and matter that eventually collapse into themselves, and that they create a new, maybe it's not even local. Maybe once things collapse in one area, that who knows where that energy is coming back out somewhere else, or it could
Right.
be that local location. But yes, it seems to me that just looking at Laniakea, and I'm not sure if
Mm,
I'm pronouncing it Laniakea, this supercluster is definitely not just like a perfect ball that's expanded,
right.
and
Right.
it's actually seeming to travel
Right.
in a very unusual directions, and it's got a shape that is definitely not just of a sphere. And
Yeah.
that may be because of other influences, um, uh, from ancient expressions of the universe and ancient superclusters that have left. We don't necessarily know in terms of how things like dark matter could function. So, all of this stuff, again, I'm talking about things that are outside of my range of real expertise, but I know enough about things that it's definitely not just one thing that's expanding and collapsing. Or
Right.
if it is, maybe it's just much, much bigger than even anything that we've been able to map out so far. And maybe this supercluster is just one part of a much, much larger
Yeah.
sphere.
Yeah, in
Um,
fact, I've always kind of thought of it as kind of like a garden, like you got different kind of fruit on different kind of trees. In fact, I've often thought, and I want to create a YouTube video on this someday where I actually illustrate this, but if we could somehow expand further out, oh, like until we finally reach a point where we would finally emerge out of an atom, and then we would, if you keep expanding, you would finally see that you're in a forest, for example, or you came out of the eye of a butterfly, who knows? What our inner space is right now. And then the same is true in the reverse. If you somehow could keep going into inner space, you would eventually, come into like an arena or a zone, an area, a realm where it's like space, the way space is to us now, where you see planets and stuff like that. And then you could finally go in. So the whole thing loops back. In fact, I've often thought of the universe. I use this analogy of the conveyor belt. So you have areas of the universe that are constantly being constructed and formed, and then there are other areas that are being deconstructed and destroyed. And so it's like this conveyor belt. And so even though all this stuff is happening, the whole totality of it is like this one overall tapestry that is fixed, that, that doesn't ever change. So you get the whole story, in other words, the whole wheel, kind of the wheel of life, the whole thing. And now that can repeat, but it's within the context, or within the that's part of how the story tells itself, is like all these subsets cycling and whatever. That's part of the matrix, or how it unfolds. But it's just, to us locally, we see these things happening locally because we're within the human conduit, so we have to experience time and space. So within that conduit, yes, we see, things grow, things evolve, things are happening. But if you somehow could, I guess, intellectually, because, no one can see the totality of the universe ever all at once, actually, but intellectually you could. And that whole thing is like this infinite cosmic bubble bath thing, where things are coming into fruition, things are closing in, and it's all cyclical. So it caused me to slowly distance away from this idea of this ultimate Big Bang, where everything, and also that it had an edge. And I should probably start kind of leading into the fact that, when it comes to a finite universe, I mean, the guy who first started this whole thing, in a way, was not only Hubble, when he was studying the Doppler effect, the redshift data with his telescope. And he came up with the idea that, well, all these parts in the universe are moving away from us, at a certain rate. But then a Catholic priest by the name of Georges Lemaitre, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, he was the guy who, and he was kind of influenced by his, religious upbringing and studies. And he had, he was influenced by Genesis, kind of like let there be light kind of a thing. And so he kind of reversed engineered, because he not only believed that these objects were moving away, but that everything in the universe was simultaneously expanding. So I think that was his contribution. And then he did a reverse engineering kind of a thing, where he thought, well, if you reverse that, it all kind of comes back to a singularity, eventually. And then that's why he thought there was a beginning. In fact, a lot of people, he wrote this book, published this book, and it was called The Primeval Atom. And it was, I think, and then the subtitle was The Hypothesis of the Origin of the Universe, I think it was. And so when people talk about him and his views, they talk, they say things like that he believed that there was a beginning, because how some nowadays, they are real careful to say the known universe or the observable universe. But they did not talk that way back then. They talked about, no, a true origin of the universe, or the birth of the universe. In fact, if you watch...
What year was this?
Well, he dates back to like around Einstein's time and Hubble. I think he was around 1933 was when he was starting to really think about all this. In fact, he was a huge fan of general theory of relativity. So he was trying to study Einstein's theory on that. In fact, he even conversed with Einstein. Einstein told him that his math is all correct, but that his theoretical physics was awful or something. I forget what he said, but Einstein actually has what's called the cosmological constant, where he was having to, because he kind of needed that idea of a expanding universe, because it was a force that he needed in order to explain the way gravity worked, because without the cosmological constant, everything would eventually just crunch. Everything, all the gravity, everything would just come in. And so he had to have kind of like this imaginary force that kind of kept everything apart somewhat. And so later, when Lemaitre became more well-known, Einstein, when he explained that particular theory of the expansion theory, Einstein thought it was like one of the most beautiful explanations of the universe. So he kind of, I guess, backpedaled a little bit and thought, okay, maybe this guy's worth something. But the thing to me, though, that I recognized of it all was that it was kind of his religious background, that he kind of had a preconceived idea that there was nothing. And then all of a sudden, God said, let there be light. And so there had to be some kind of initiation, some kind of beginning and explode. And he didn't term we call it the Big Bang. I forget what scientist, that was another scientist that called it the Big Bang, but he still called it the expansion theory from a singularity. So,
Well, I'd like to kind of, at some point, I think that's going to be an important part of my summary, is to get back to this idea of the let there be light and this idea of God. Because, I think that's really, to some degree, why we're coming to have this discussion, is not just to kind of like work out, work out the astrophysics, the physics of this, as much as to kind of theorize on more of a pantheistic perspective, or get into some of these final, beyond the map. What is the map even drawn upon, and what is the foundation of the universe itself? And I am convinced that behind all phenomenon, and phenomenon by its nature being quantifiable, that anything that is quantifiable cannot therefore be infinite. But I do believe that not even believe, it's a sensibility that goes into a type of irrational logic, that everything must be founded upon infinity, and that infinity itself, instead of it being a complex idea, because we tend to think, oh, well, infinite is just so much more and more and more, and you just keep on, well, take this big number and then add even more zeros. Well, actually, I think that infinity is a little bit more like, if you look at an MC Escher picture, everything, sometimes at the center, you've got these large figures, and then towards the edge, they get smaller and smaller and smaller. But at a certain point, they really do just kind of merge into the edge, and they become, you can't see anything anymore. And of course, what it's going to ultimately be is something that is beyond details, and that it's going to actually go settle into something that's quite simple. And that's what I think, is that at the center of all existence, we have all this variety, but at the center of existence, I think, is something is A, quite simple, but B, also infinite. And that from that infinite simplicity can come quasi-infinite, but not quite infinite complexity. So where we have all the complexity itself emerges from this pure simplicity.
I agree with
eventually that complexity itself can no longer kind of,
I agree. Yeah.
maintain itself, and eventually merges back into the simplicity and the infinite
Yes.
simplicity behind all things. And, really, we're not going to ever, we're just these tiny little living beings on this tiny little speck of a planet in the middle of a solar system that's in the middle of a galaxy that's in the middle of a much bigger supercluster of galaxies. So, we're not going to be able to observe the whole universe, or even wrap our minds around what it may be.
Also, similar to your point, not an allowable infinite number of possibilities. I'm real big on that. Like I actually believe that that not just anything can manifest itself, not just anything can happen. There's kind of these rules with the universe, and so and these conditions. And so I don't believe in infinite possibilities. And so
Right.
yeah,
You can't have a part of the universe where every law that we know doesn't work the way we know, because the reason why the laws work the way they work is because it wouldn't work. It can't work in any other way. It has
right.
to.
Exactly.
It's like you can't just like switch all of the different like rules
Right.
here and have things that pass.
Yeah.
Basically, that do illogical things, because illogical things can't really happen. And
Yeah. Yeah.
getting back to like this idea of God and so forth, you had mentioned nothing. And whereas I want to bring in this idea where, of course, Richard Dawkins is never going to be able to discuss God, and he doesn't want to really even discuss things like infinity. But, my feeling about what we call God is really not that it is this, an architect, clockmaker, something that's basically outside of reality, but it's the fundamental fact of what infinity is, that infinity is not a being, but infinity is the beingness of the universe. And so instead
Yes.
of understanding God as a creator or God as an architect, that God is more of an infinity from which everything else emerges and eventually has to reemerge and come back into. And so it's what I call an infinite pool of being as opposed to a ground, because I see this idea of a pool of something where all things from below and above can all reach a surface, and that surface itself, and we're thinking in terms right now of a three-dimensional or two-dimensional surface, but really we're thinking, I'm thinking that this surface is not really dimensional as we understand it, or it's hyper or maybe meta-dimensional, but from which all other dimensions emerge. And so that basically all phenomenal properties that we can understand end up basically collapsing into this singularity. And that basically the singularity, which scientists love to just, assume as a purely scientific concept, is really there's something magical about this. It's something about the fact, and I don't mean magic that it's acausal, but it's magic in the sense that everything can emerge from nothing. Well, that is a magic trick. That's pulling everything out of a magic hat, out of a top hat. But it's really, it's just as we're starting to discover the qualities and the properties of quantum mechanics, in spite of it being very non-intuitive or not something that we can understand, it is how things work. And I think that saying that it's coming from nothing isn't correct. It's coming from an invisible infinity that is inside of or behind and underpinning all reality. And, the fact that Dawkins can't really accept the idea of infinity being able to have quantum properties and properties that go beyond his rational understanding is a little odd to me. I mean, why is it that we, if we have a scientific mind, that we can't accept, we're seeing quantum physics is doing all kinds of things like non-local, exchange of information. How can you have information that's existing in one place, and then that same exact information that requires zero time to influence information in another place? So clearly the universe doesn't just function in purely causal or logical ways as we, traditionally.
We know it, in fact, you said something that made me reminded me that, even though I don't believe that the universe was created or that it had a first time creation point, and especially one that's fully localized, I still believe in the ultimate cause. So, as a pantheist, when I think of, God is the universe and how did I come to be, at least the human conduit that I am, there is that cause, that which is responsible for my existence, that which is the ultimate cause of my existence and the cause of the universe. So there is that. And it's a very beautiful tapestry, and it requires all of it. In order for any of it to work, it requires the whole tapestry interacting the way it interacts and facilitating it and promoting, it's like this self-perpetuating machine, the ultimate self-perpetuating machine. In fact, probably the only one that will ever exist that truly is self-perpetual. And there is that ultimate cause, even though I don't think of it in terms of creation, trying to pin down. Some people talk about like a primordial soup, or like this fabric or this ether substance, and that's okay too. That everything's made of. It's just that there's such dynamics involved, and that it's that dynamics that creates that amazing tapestry, and it's unchangeable, by the way, that tapestry. It has always been that way, it always will be. And if you want to know, in my view, what the synopsis of that tapestry is. It's the yin and the yang. I mean, if that's like the lowest resolution you can ever get if you want to take a snapshot of what the universe is. And then if you want to get more pixelated, more resolution, then you can look at the seasons, like you say, you got summer, fall, winter, the whole wheel there, and then the animal kingdom. And so you can look at, the universe through that lens of those properties, which have to be in place.
Now you're saying when you say the tapestry is unchanging, you mean that the laws themselves, because
Yeah, like the laws and the
evolving.
nature. Yeah, the nature of the universe.
The tapestry is a moving tapestry, but it's
Well,
ultimately.
from our point of view, it is. But I just mean the established, I don't want to say design because then that gives the impression of a designer, but the pattern, I'll say pattern, the pattern that we're left with. In fact, this leads into the final nail in the coffin for me when I started thinking about things like an airfoil on the wing of a plane, that specific shape that you need in order to create lift. I mean, even before the Wright brothers were born, even before planet Earth was formed, that very concept of the airfoil existed. The very concept of 1 + 2 = 3, that
Sure.
there could have never been a condition of the universe where that wasn't true, where that didn't exist. And I don't mean the materialization of things, for example, the concept of a cup. I just mean the concept of it. So yes,
But
that
it could be, and I suppose this is what most astrophysicists and quantum physicists would assume, is that basically as pure energy, which is, as we theorize it and as you look at these, which is, I've always found this to be utterly, amazing that we could talk about not only the first second of creation of the moment after the Big Bang, but we're talking into, almost infinitesimal, slices of that first second, to where we're talking about the very basic properties of matter and, of time and space are unfolding within that first millisecond, and that different dimensions and properties are coming out. And, I find that to be, it's staggering to my mind that people have worked this out and it's understood essentially that, we would say, I don't even want to try to, I haven't even looked at this for so many years, but within that first couple milliseconds, we've had different dimensions and properties and aspects of phenomena that are unfolding. And my understanding of this must be that as pure energy confronts, say, the abyss, the void, and that as it is already cooling, that many things start to develop in terms of how does that pure energy transform, for example, into light, and how does that transform into the many.
Let me ask you right quick. I hear people use the term pure energy, and I've always fundamentally understood energy at its core to mean basically matter in motion. So whenever you have matter in motion, then you're going to have energy and the propagation of that energy.
Well, what is matter though? Because matter isn't.
Well, I know.
Matter really isn't real. I mean, matter is just active energy. It's more or less.
I finally decided to chalk up matter is to that which is the resistant portion of the universe, to me, the perceiver. So, but yeah, trying to actually tack that down, I understand that.
I think basically the idea of what we understand matter is that energy itself forms packets and basically everything is force fields. And so what we understand is physical matter is different force fields and when I say force fields, we're not talking Star Trek, we're talking about that basically we've got resistances and things that they can't merge. They're not coming together in a merger. They're pushing away from each other. And so basically you've got things that, you've got bundles of energy here and bundles of energy here that are not in sync. So when they come together, those spins and those vibrations they're not merging, they're repelling each other. And so I think that what we understand as matter is the accumulation of energies into different masses and different formations that either attract or repel. And things that can attract in ways that they can be destructive or they can be constructive, or they're probably some mixture of both of those things.
Speaking of energy, it was actually because of energy, because of the conservation of mass and energy. That's actually why modern scientists finally started being careful to say the known universe, and that there wasn't an ultimate beginning, because they always, the law of conservation, energy can't be created nor destroyed. So they finally were left with that violation, that if there was an ultimate beginning and there was no before, then it almost gives the idea that, well, maybe energy was created, kind of a thing, and then maybe one day energy can be destroyed. But so far, we don't have any evidence of that. And so that was one of the reasons why they started liking the idea of parallel universes and cyclical, big bangs, big crunches, and that there never was a true, I mean, they're starting to lean this way. This is what I'm starting to see, that they're starting to admit that maybe the outdated view of a finite universe that had a one-time origin, and a singularity, that maybe we need to rethink that. And then, just as I was briefly talking to you about before we started the podcast, there are these now respectable scientists who are coming forward, astrophysicists coming forward, saying that not only was the Big Bang, do they think the Big Bang theory doesn't hold water, but that it never held water, and that it should have never been pushed forward, and that people who were pushing it forward were getting fired and weren't getting tenure. And so they all kind of, mainstream science, in other words, kind of pushed out anybody who tried to go against teaching about, or teaching anything against the Big Bang.
Well, we talked about, before we started recording, we started talking about, I made a little parallel in terms of evolution and biology, and how, it's one thing to discuss alternatives to the Darwinian view of evolution. But, when you start getting into speculation, creation, you start talking about, guided evolution, and the idea that species were always intended to be a certain thing. In other words, sort of a creationist's view. Mm-hmm. Now you're breaking out of real evolution discussion. As far as I'm concerned, in terms of the idea of the Big Bang, there's something to the idea that, if we're seeing everything is expanding away from each other, well, then that means if you reverse time, they must have been coming in.
But one of the things is about that reversal.
So they must be expanding out from somewhere.
Right, but see, here's 2 points about that. One is, if we look at a tree, for example, and how a tree grows, well, we could reverse engineer that and see that how it must have.
Just imagine it in reverse.
Right. Yeah. But if you reimagine it, there's a point that you need to stop responsibly, because we know that you could say the same thing about a tree, that it came from a singularity, but we know that's not true. I mean, it came from a seed, but it didn't come from an actual point, singularity point particle as described in the Big Bang theory. But you can make that argument. So I've noticed that nature and the universe never does anything continuously, uninterrupted, forever and ever. So like that's what Lemaitre did when he reverse engineered and tried to imagine everything reversing. He just kept going and thinking that it was going to do that smoothly, uninterrupted, all the way until there was a singularity. And see, that's where I would say he went wrong, being naive to think that the universe just does that continuously, smoothly, uninterrupted like that. And then the other point I was going to make is, those scientists that are now coming forward that I was telling you about, they're actually saying now that the redshift data that we observe is more likely actually caused from maybe all that travel time through interstellar dust, and that is draining the energy of the electromagnetic waves that finally reach us. And so that's why it stands to reason that the further away it is, the redder the shift. So it's just having its energy drained.
Not necessarily moving away as much.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily expanding or moving. Yeah. And
well, okay, I mean, that's always possible too. Just getting back to kind of what you had mentioned with the tree, I'm more, my philosophy is called biotheism, and I really hold that level of a theological and spiritual view of biology, because I think that it's a metaphor that doesn't, it's on our level. Biology is not a metaphor, it's very real. But I think if we try to just take that example you gave of a tree and then reversing its growth into a
Right.
seed, but then that seed itself was up in the branches and was part of another tree before it, and then that
Right.
in a cycle going back. I tend to
Yeah.
think, and we look at the universe. Uh, well, when I was a kid, I remember a story, and I forget the name of it, and I have no idea where it came from. It was one of the short stories that I read, and it was about looking at the big picture of the universe. And as you zoomed out further and further, it turned out that really our galaxy was just another, like more or less a cell or a set
Right.
of in a
Yes.
much larger being, and that it basically you zoom,
Right.
and now you're seeing another person, maybe not like us, but essentially you just keep zooming out and now it's become
Yeah.
a person.
That's how
And
I
we look
see it. Yeah.
and we when we look through the telescopes, we're starting to see these clusters and connections that
Oh, right. Right.
very close similarity. And of course, this is a big meme on Facebook of how the structure of the larger, the macro universe really seems to reflect the structure
Yeah, in
of our
parallel.
neurons,
Right.
and those are connected. And so it really does leave the mind, expands the concept of the imagination. The imagination wants to see everything sort of, as below, so above.
Uh, yeah.
This whole idea, and and I do think that when we look at, say, for example, the Mandelbrot set and the fractals, there's something very tree-like in the way that they
Yeah.
express themselves.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
so, if we keep this idea of a tree, and you had said earlier, a garden or a forest, I think there's got to be something to it, to all of it like this, is that basically, as far as whether it's coming from one singular source or it's from many, many of them, maybe even almost infinite sources, there's got to be something to how things are growing, and they're growing out of themselves, and that they're basically expanding. Of course, fractals, we see them everywhere. The nature of this reality is
Yes.
fractal.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so, if we think of where did the fractals come from and where does the source of the fractal? Well, there's really no point you can zoom in or zoom out where anything really changes. And I suspect, my suspicion, and because I'm a biotheist, I pretty much apply this concept to everything, that at all points that when you look at things, you're going to be seeing formations that are going to be similar to fractals, to trees, to corals. And this is kind of like basically reflects the pattern of the map of the universe at every level, no matter which,
Yeah.
whatever level you're viewing it from. But behind all of that, I think, again, like I said, everything merges into a certain singularity, and whether that singularity is at a single point. And I don't think that that makes any sense. I think that the real fact of what a singularity is that it's everywhere and it's nowhere. And that as
Right.
to
Yeah.
whether,
We're in the singularity right now.
sure, and we're in the
I mean,
singularity and the multiplicity at the same time, and that's its own yin yang as well. And
yeah.
I think at all times we're in a state of the unmanifest universe and the manifest together.
Yeah.
That those basically, and it's not, we think of pantheists saying that there's something outside of the universe. Well, perhaps there's something that has a character that is, for example, the universe itself is an expression of the finite quantities, but there is something towards the edge where everything blends into the infinite. And so I don't think that the infinite, even though it may have certain characteristics that differ from the finite, and therefore it may be, categorically separate. I don't see it as being outside, and I don't understand an idea of saying, oh, well, there is this infinite God that is outside of the universe, and then there's the universe that's inside the mind of God. I can't see there as being any separation, because if it's inside the mind of God, if it's inside of infinity, and that's basically how I see it, is that infinity exists, and that the entire universe, even if it has no borders, is within this infinity, somewhat like a fish bowl, but maybe not a bowl, just basically an ocean, like a, I mean, we're getting you get to the point where you have to just deal with poetry, because I think that it's impossible to answer some of these outside of a more poetic expression. And if I could, because I do think, as far as what people want to listen to and, how long we can talk about this, I kind of want to sort of go in and sort of summarize some of my thoughts, and then let you kind of take over from there, and then we can kind of, and that would be, I've had this discussion and discussions like this many times with other people on my page, and with, as a philosophical discussion. And a lot of times I say, all of these things, this is fascinating, it's important, and it's definitely worth investigating. But in the end, we're not going to really know those things. And we're going to need, really what we need to know are some basic moral stances about what we're doing and how we're living our life in this world at this, tiny little supposedly insignificant level. But in my mind, everything that we're doing at this level, that we're doing here, and we're having this conversation, it seems like to the universe, it's a speck of nothing. But really, this is where I think that, as far as me as a human, this is on my scale. And what's happening on my scale, those are the things that I can discuss. And those are the things that I can say, okay, on a daily basis, I wake up and I decide, today I'm doing this, and I confront a certain situation. And I have a very small number of considerations to make a decision about my life on a daily basis, on a very small local scale. I think those things in the end are more important than answering the big questions. And that it's actually just fine to leave things at some degree of poetic certainty.
Yeah.
It's the great.
Yeah, it's like staring too far into the sun. You finally just get blinded, and it's just like, I've always felt that there's only so much that, as philosophers, as human perceivers, we're not going to be able to put in all the puzzle pieces. We're just not. So you finally have to be able to just step back and kind of on a philosophical level, take an educated guess, a responsible guess as to what the overall picture is. And you still may not, you're never going to know that it's right. But if it helps you, live, your life, and if you have life lessons, you've learned those life lessons, that's what we need to kind of focus on. Because I have fun, thinking about, the totality of it all. I get off on it. I love thinking, is it, does it have an edge to it, or is it infinite? But I also
I love it too. I think it's something that really exercises the brain, and and there are, of course, experts who are investigating this in a way where I suspect that they are they're coming to understand things about the universe. And clearly our science and our telescopes and our ability to map the universe is showing us, we can really build something from these theories, and build something that is a type of knowledge that adds to the breadth of our human knowledge. But in the long run, in the basic big picture, it's really not going to make a difference to us at all about whether, the universe is, let me give you an example. There's a lot of people who I've had say, well, what does it all matter? We're all going to get absorbed by the sun eventually, so nothing that we're doing here really matters, because, in 3 billion years, the sun's going to expand and it's going to suck in the earth, and and everything here is going to be gone. And
yeah, but that's just a small, that's just a small bubble.
You're worried about the meaninglessness of your life based on an event that's happening 3 billion years in the future. And these people are actually getting nihilistic about it. And I'm saying, focus on your day, focus on your relationship to your family, and things won't be so meaningless just because, 3 billion years in the future, the sun's going to absorb the earth. And I do think that it's fascinating. It's something we should know. But do we have to prepare for the fact that Earth is going to be, consumed by the sun in 3 billion years? I don't think so, really. So anyway, that's kind of my conclusive. My conclusion is that, to me, it's probably not going to matter what the nature of the universe is so much as, what is the nature of me and you and of tomorrow, and in what's happening in my town. Those are the things that are going to matter the most. But at the same time, this is still, it is important. It's not I think it's necessary. Now,
you kind of mentioned the parallels earlier, and it just got me thinking about how I think many people have also looked at the planets, and they've kind of seen a parallel with subatomic particles. How atoms and quarks and protons and electrons and neutrons, and it kind of has kind of a planetary, even though we no longer think of planetary spins and orbits, and although it could be that way, but they now have a different model for the atom now, but still, it's
There's a
still
lot
kind
of
of,
parallels for
it's,
sure.
yeah, it still is I mean, it's going to be a little different at that level, of course, but there's still a strong similarity. It's almost like the cycle has finally started again, at least to a degree. Now, it might take until you really go into inner space, and then, okay, then you'll finally see the planetary-like structure or particles. But also what you were saying a while ago, I kind of believe in reincarnation. And so I believe that even if our planet goes into the sun eventually, and whatever happens to me, I am confident that the overall tapestry is going to always be in place, and ultimately the universe is going to take care of itself. And me as a passenger, a perceiving passenger that goes from one life to the next, I'm ultimately going to be okay. I mean, I'm going to have my ups and downs. I'm going to suffer because we all have moments of suffering, moments of sadness. But then there's also the joy and the pleasure, and it's just we're going to always undulate up and down, through the trek of life, through that in that way. And when you say it won't fully matter, but one way that it does matter to me is it does give me a sense of relief where just because I believe, I think I know how the nature of the universe works, and of course I could be wrong. I could be very wrong. I'm wrong about something at least once a day, but I feel a sense of comfort in my worldview, and I have to be careful to say that that's not the reason why I believe it, because I actually believe in a lot of things that are not comforting, that are not pleasant, so I don't let that cloud my judgment. That's important to say here. But there are certain aspects of my philosophy and the way that I view the universe, the nature of the universe, that it just works out that there are aspects of it that are very comforting, that I'm real happy about, because I now don't believe that the universe could ever become fully corrupt or fully destroyed forever and ever, and then that's it, and it never reemerges, kind of a thing, which is really a dark image that some people have, actually, because they think the universe is finite and they think it'll maybe one day just crunch, or that where it quivers and just peters out. It doesn't necessarily come back, but it gets cold. It cools off and it's just nothing. So it's kind of a very dark, depressing view. And I'm not trying to tell people to believe the opposite just because it'll comfort you and help your emotions. But it does work out that if you can intellectually see that, no, that's not actually how it happens. It's not going to just quiver into darkness and become this cold nothing. That's kind of a warm feeling for me. I like the fact that that's the case. So
Yeah, it's interesting for me. I've never really thought that I should, direct my philosophy with the intention of finding something that comforts me. I'm more interested in kind of just understanding how things work. And if it happens to be something that's quite uncomfortable, well, I'm going to go in that direction. But, and I think maybe I can kind of conclude some of these, because I think we're going on for almost about an hour at this point or more.
yeah.
But with a couple quotes, and on that particular one, I'll always remember it's Mark Twain has a quote, and he says that basically I had been dead, and I don't know if that makes sense, but I had been dead for billions of years before I was born, and it never mattered one whit to me about, and so why should it matter one whit to me afterwards? But
I think Alan Watts said something similar, but go ahead. Yeah.
And yeah, well, that I'm sure this particular one is a Mark Twain, but that's funny because I actually have another Alan Watts kind of lined up as my.
And I have heard that quote from Twain, but yeah, there's two similar, but they're basically conveying the same idea that they all those years, and they weren't concerned about it all those times. But yeah.
Now, this is not really about the Big Bang, but it's going back to our idea of the singularity and the infinity that that humans identify as God. But as that being the ground of being, and we are beings that have emerged, just like the universe, we have emerged from this ground of being, we are also self-identified with that ground of being. And that ground of being what creates all of the universe, can never die. It is life itself, or it is what we call the basis of life itself, just as its being is from what all beings emerge from. Our life is emerging from something that is of a, I said it had magical properties. I do think that there is this idea of consciousness being a fundamental property. I think all these things should be kept in mind on this topic. Now, Richard Dawkins is not going to say everything has emerged because it was sort of came out of God, and that God is all consciousness, and that consciousness and energy are one and the same. But I do hold that it's not consciousness as we understand human consciousness, but that basically the fundamental property of energy is awareness. And that awareness is because everything is coming out of itself. It is all part of itself. And therefore, everything is essentially, basically, it comes from a singularity that is, how do I say, in the idea that quantum information can transcend all space and time, that this awareness transcends all space and time, that all things have connection to each other because they all come from the same source and are of the same source. Now I want to just get to this one quote from Alan Watts, and this has happened to be, I just came across this today, and it seemed like I felt like it was something that made sense for our video today. And it goes like this. He says, "We're all present at the creation of the universe. This is it, today, this moment. Don't look to the past for some big bang. The past will tell you nothing because the past vanishes like an echo. But now is when it begins. Now is the time. Now is the day of our salvation. It begins right now. This is where it's at." In other words, he's saying that the Big Bang is not a time in the past, and it's not a time in the future, that basically the universe, its expansion, its destruction, its collapse onto itself, we're really beyond, we are beyond, by being part of that singularity, we're beyond time and space. We're beyond life and death. And that really, all of the universe, whether it's something that's happening, here at this local, in this local place, whether it's, I'm trying to kind of tie a lot of this together, but basically what I'm saying is that it seems to me that all of the creation and destruction and all of the time, it really kind of collapses into itself right now, into this moment. And that the Big Bang is really about, every moment that we exist is its own first moment and first creation, and the destruction as well. And that we're basically, we can talk about vast stretches of time, but it all collapses into the now. And,
always. You are the summation of the all, or the summation of all things, and in each moment that passes, that constant recreation, or that us being sustained. Because that has to be addressed, the way whatever the universe is, the way it's constantly perpetuating and constantly being possible. The fact that it's even possible, even once. I did forget to mention earlier when I was talking about the scientists, the respectable scientists who are now coming forward. One of the really amazing pieces of information that they're getting is from quasars. And I don't fully understand it. I used to, because I watched the documentary really closely at the time, but it's been a while since I've seen it. So I'm going to just try to give you the gist of it. But it had to do with the fact that what they're observing with quasars, and I think it was either the creation of quasars where it has a tail. Anyway, the information just was incongruent or in violation of Hubble's law. the fact that, it's supposed to be really far away and really energetic, but the results that they're getting with these certain quasars completely violates that law, that theory. And it looks like it's actually, at least parts of it are either really close, and then the other part is astronomically too far away that it doesn't jive, it doesn't gel. And then there's now supposed to be evidence from the James Webb telescope. I haven't looked into that, but I heard that it's gotten a lot of people both excited and nervous, modern scientists who are just so gung-ho about the Big Bang. They're getting nervous about it. So
one thing I do know is, I mean, I know enough about astronomy to know that there's some things like, for example, you said a quasar, and sometimes I'm trying to recall the difference, but with a pulsar, and I've heard that some of these planets are these star systems or stars, pulsars, let's just call them, are absolutely massive, but they're spinning at thousands of times a second. I mean,
and then they say, in fact,
how
they
is
say
that even possible?
That's why they even had to come up with the idea of dark matter, because they say certain things are spinning and certain things are flying apart or staying together. And it looks like that there's like some additional force holding these things together that they don't know about. The other possibility is that they're just wrong about, their original conception. It kind of reminds me of when we first started studying the solar system, or trying to make theories about the solar system. Early astronomers kept making adjustments in order to make the original theory that the Earth was at the center. So they were doing all kinds of weird epicycles and trying to do weird stuff just to try to preserve that. But then we finally just were responsible enough to abandon all that and say the sun is at the center, and that makes more sense. So, yeah.
Well, it may, with some of the information and some of the behaviors that we're seeing, it may be more true than we think that, how these macro objects behave may actually be, the micro to some other, meta macro.
I just can't help but to believe that we are within a shell, within a shell, within a shell infinitely, and that there never really is a true.
I don't think that that's the case, but there's, what I mean, this universe, it just seems to be a Pandora's box of just more and more oddities that that we know, the more mind-boggling it becomes. And that is definitely what's happening with a lot of these quantum physics. And that's why a lot of people say, why, I guess I don't know who it came from, but they said, if you think you understand
then you don't understand
quantum physics, then you don't understand.
Then you don't understand it.
It's the same thing. If you think you understand astrophysics, then you don't know astrophysics.
Right.
So,
I can only, like I was saying earlier, I can only, even though all the puzzle pieces, they'll never be fully provable puzzle pieces, you know what I mean? But as a philosopher, I just hope the scientists will give us a little margin, a little freedom to kind of take that philosophical leap, hopefully a responsible one, but to do a little bit of guesswork and to kind of step back to try to see what the overall picture is of the puzzle, the puzzle piece. And it's three kittens in a basket playing with some yarn. Just kidding. When I think of jigsaw puzzles, that's usually what they're putting together or something like that. But yeah, the overall picture, I try to imagine or try to assess what the overall picture is. And we'll never know for sure, though, of course,
Well,
but I guess
we've come to know, even in our own lifetimes, there's a lot of new things that have been discovered. So there's always new things to find out, and to open up the speculation even further with new information that, today we can speculate about things that are much beyond what they could have 100 years ago. And we know some things that, so in other words, the more we know, the more it opens us up to even further speculation and more wild possibilities.
And lines of reasoning can actually take us quite far. For example, just the idea that I was explaining a while ago, the concept of 1 + 2 = 3, and how could there be an origin to mathematics? You know what I mean? And mathematical constructs. So when you stop and just try to analyze the nature of the universe logically and try to use lines of reasoning, even though I've never even done an experiment, to try to ascertain whether or not 1 + 2 = 3 is something that could have an origin. Just logically thinking about it, when I think of stuff like that, it gives me pause. It makes me cautious. Like, well, could there really be a first-time creation point and a condition where mathematics didn't exist? It just seems like that's something. And then when you think of all the other timeless forms in that same regard, whether it's the concept of a cup or the concept of president assassinations or boys pulling on the hair of, pulling the pigtails of girls. There's all these little life lessons and life scenarios that are a part of that fabric, and it can't ever not be a part of it. And you could never say there was a time when, I'll give you some of my favorite examples, like a rolling stone gathers no moss, or don't put all your eggs in one basket. Those expressions, and there's 1,000 of them, that those type of expressions just have these eternal truisms that, they don't have an origin. It's like, it's always true that you shouldn't put all your eggs in one basket. So, and that a rolling stone gathers no moss, and that do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. So all those little life lessons, those are eternal. They're eternal truths. But yeah, I think we have carried this discussion long enough. We've gone a little over an hour, so I think
For those
we
who
can.
stuck with it,
Yeah. I appreciate everyone who made it this far in the discussion, so thank you for joining us. And if you're interested in my book, The Forever All, I will leave a link in the description, and also in the group that Peter created called Biosophy, which is a Facebook group, and I will leave a link for that. So, okay, thank you. Bye for now.